in the heart of an unending polar night, where the howling wind sculpted ice into alien spires and the stars above burned cold and distant, a lone human man knelt beside the glow of a sputtering fire. His name was Caleb, a trapper and survivalist who had long since chosen the solitude of the Arctic tundra over the complications of civilization. His igloo, a sturdy dome of compacted snow, shielded him from the worst of the storm that raged outside, but its warmth was waning. He added another chunk of seal blubber to the flame, watching it sputter and hiss as the fat caught fire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound, until a faint scratching reached his ears. Caleb froze, his hand instinctively drifting to the rifle propped against the wall. The scratching grew louder, a deliberate scraping against the igloo's snow-packed entrance. It wasn't the erratic noise of the wind or the shuffle of an animal. It was methodical. Someone or something was outside. Heart pounding, Caleb stood and moved cautiously toward the opening. He lifted the flap of fur that served as a door and was met by a rush of icy air. A figure collapsed inside, their sudden weight forcing him back. The firelight danced across a form both familiar and otherworldly. A woman, yet not entirely human. Her skin shimmered faintly, a deep iridescent blue that seemed to ripple like water under the fire's glow. Long, dark hair clung to her face and shoulders, streaked with frost. Her eyes, large and luminous, locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath hitch. She was clad in what appeared to be organic armor, sleek and ridged, but it was battered and torn in several places, revealing more of her strangely luminous skin. She shivered violently, clutching herself as if the cold had finally pierced whatever protection her alien biology provided. Caleb hesitated only a moment before slamming the flap shut and dragging her closer to the fire. She didn't resist, though her sharp, elongated nails scraped lightly against his arm as she steadied herself. "You're freezing," he murmured, unsure if she could understand him. He grabbed a thick fur blanket and wrapped it around her trembling form. The woman, if that's what she truly was, tilted her head, her gaze darting around the small igloo. Her movements were sharp, predatory, yet there was a vulnerability in the way she clutched the blanket. She spoke then, her voice a strange, melodic hum punctuated by clicks and hisses. Caleb couldn't make sense of the words, but the desperation in her tone was clear. "I don't understand," he said, crouching beside her. He gestured toward the fire and then to her, hoping she'd grasp his meaning. "Warmth. Stay here." Her glowing eyes softened, and she nodded slightly, a universal gesture that eased some of his tension. She inched closer to the fire, her shivering gradually subsiding. Caleb watched her with a mixture of fascination and wariness. What was she? How had she come to be out here, in this frozen wilderness, where even the hardiest creatures struggled to survive? As the hours passed, the storm outside showed no signs of abating. Caleb busied himself with tending to the fire and preparing a meal, all the while acutely aware of his unusual guest. She observed him in silence, her gaze unblinking but no longer threatening. When he offered her a piece of dried fish, she accepted it hesitantly, studying it before taking a cautious bite. Her expression shifted to one of mild surprise, and she nodded in approval. "Glad you like it," Caleb said with a faint smile. He felt an odd sense of relief at her reaction, as if earning her approval mattered more than he wanted to admit. Over time, they established a rudimentary form of communication. She pointed to herself and made a sound that Caleb approximated as Ky'rea. When he repeated it, her lips curved into what might have been a smile. He introduced himself in turn, and though her pronunciation of his name was imperfect, it was close enough. Ky'rea's presence, while strange, brought an unexpected warmth to the igloo. She was graceful in a way that reminded him of a snow leopard, her every movement deliberate and fluid. Yet there were moments when she seemed almost childlike, marveling at the simplest things, the crackle of the fire, the texture of fur, the taste of fresh seal meat. As days turned into weeks, the storm relented, but Ky'rea showed no inclination to leave. Caleb found himself reluctant to bring it up. There was something about her that fascinated him, a mystery he was compelled to unravel. She seemed equally curious about him, often mimicking his actions or studying him with an intensity that made his cheeks burn. One evening, as they sat side by the fire, Ky'rea reached out and touched his hand. Her skin was cool, but not unpleasantly so, and the gesture felt oddly intimate. She spoke then, her melodic voice softer than before. Though Caleb couldn't understand her words, he caught the emotion behind them, gratitude, perhaps even affection. "You're welcome," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't quite name. But their fragile peace was shattered when an otherworldly howl pierced the night. Ky'rea stiffened, her head snapping toward the entrance. She rose in a single, fluid motion, her earlier vulnerability replaced by a steely resolve. Caleb grabbed his rifle, heart racing. "What is it?" he asked, though he knew she wouldn't answer. She turned to him, her luminous eyes filled with urgency. She pointed to the fire and then to the rifle, making a series of sharp gestures. Caleb understood enough. They were in danger. The howl came again, closer this time. Ky'rea moved to the entrance, her organic armor shifting and hardening as if in response to her heightened alertness. Caleb followed, his grip on the rifle tight. When they stepped outside, the icy wind bit into his face, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the shapes emerging from the storm, creatures unlike anything he'd ever seen. They were massive, their forms hulking and vaguely insectoid, with spiked limbs that crunched through the snow. Ky'rea let out a low, guttural sound that reverberated in her chest. The creatures hesitated, their glowing eyes fixed on her. She stepped forward, her posture radiating both defiance and authority. One of the creatures lunged, and in a blur of motion, Ky'rea met it head-on. Caleb watched in awe as she fought with a ferocity that belied her slender frame. Her movements were a deadly dance, her elongated nails slicing through chitinous armor with ease. But the creatures were relentless, and for every one she felled, another seemed to emerge from the storm. Realizing she couldn't fight them all alone, Caleb raised his rifle and fired. The sharp crack of the shot echoed across the tundra, and one of the creatures crumpled to the ground. Ky'rea glanced back at him, her expression unreadable, before resuming her assault. Together, they fought side by side, man and alien Huntress against the monstrous tide. When the final creature fell, the silence that followed was deafening. Caleb's breaths came in ragged gasps, his arms trembling from the effort of reloading and firing. Ky'rea stood over the last fallen creature, her posture regal despite the blood, both hers and theirs, that stained her armor. She turned to him then, and for the first time, Caleb saw her smile fully. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it warmed him more than any fire ever could. In the days that followed, Caleb and Ky'rea grew closer. The danger had forged a bond between them, one that transcended words and species. Though he still didn't know where she had come from or what she was, Caleb no longer cared. In her, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing, a connection, however unlikely, that gave new meaning to his solitary existence. And as the Arctic sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the snow in hues of gold and pink, Caleb knew one thing for certain. His life, like the endless tundra, would never be the same. With the return of the sun, the Arctic's harsh beauty seemed almost welcoming. The ice fields sparkled, the light fracturing into a million colors. Caleb and Ky'rea stood at the entrance of his igloo, gazing out at the endless expanse. The battle from days before had left its marks, not only on the land but on Caleb's heart. He glanced at Ky'rea, her alien features framed by the soft glow of dawn. She seemed at peace, her luminous eyes reflecting the light like twin beacons. Despite their growing bond, Caleb couldn't shake the sense that her presence here was tied to something far greater than the storm that had brought her to him. The creatures they'd fought were unlike anything he'd ever seen. They had been hunting her. Of that much he was certain. But why? And where had they come from? Ky'rea, as if sensing his unease, touched his arm gently. She gestured toward the horizon, where the land rose into jagged cliffs and glaciers, and spoke in her melodic, clicking language. Caleb frowned, trying to interpret her meaning. She repeated the gesture, then pointed to herself and mimed walking. "You want to go there?" he asked, pointing to the cliffs. She nodded, her expression serious. It wasn't an easy decision. The journey to the cliffs would take days, perhaps weeks, through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. But Caleb knew he couldn't let her go alone. The bond they'd forged during the battle had become something unspoken yet unbreakable. He nodded, shouldering his pack and gesturing for her to follow. The journey was grueling. The Arctic's beauty was deceptive. Beneath its serene facade lurked dangers at every turn. Blizzards swept through the plains, obscuring their path. Cracks in the ice threatened to swallow them whole. Caleb's survival instincts, honed through years of solitude, were pushed to their limits. Yet Ky'rea proved to be an extraordinary companion. Her alien physiology allowed her to navigate the terrain with an uncanny grace, and her senses often alerted them to danger before it struck. At night, they huddled together for warmth, their bodies wrapped in layers of fur. Caleb found himself marveling at her resilience and her vulnerability. Despite her otherworldly strength, she was not invincible. He noticed the way she winced when she moved certain ways, the way her luminous skin dimmed when exhaustion overtook her. He did his best to care for her, tending to her wounds with the limited supplies he had. In return, she shared what little she could, pointing out edible plants or creating strange, glowing poultices from substances she gathered along the way. They didn't need words to communicate anymore. A glance, a gesture, a shared smile. They had built a language of their own. Caleb found himself opening up to her in ways he never had with another person. He told her about his life before the Arctic, about the family he had lost and the loneliness that had driven him to this frozen exile. Ky'rea listened intently, her luminous eyes soft with understanding. Though she couldn't share her own story in words, her expressions and gestures conveyed more than enough. When they finally reached the cliffs, Caleb was struck by their sheer scale. Massive walls of ice and rock loomed above them, their surfaces glistening in the sunlight. Ky'rea led him to a hidden crevasse, her movements purposeful. Inside, the air was strangely warm, and the ice walls glowed faintly with an inner light. Caleb realized with a start that they weren't entirely natural. The crevasse opened into a cavern, its ceiling arching high above. Strange markings adorned the walls, patterns that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow. Ky'rea approached one of the walls, pressing her hand against it. The light intensified, spreading outward in intricate patterns that seemed to respond to her touch. A low hum filled the air, resonating in Caleb's chest. "What is this place?" he murmured, his voice echoing in the cavern. Ky'rea turned to him, her expression unreadable. She gestured for him to stay back as she stepped into the center of the room. The hum grew louder, and the air seemed to shimmer. Caleb watched in awe as a pillar of light erupted from the floor, surrounding Ky'rea in a cocoon of energy. Her form became indistinct, her features blurring into the light. When the glow faded, she stood there, unharmed but transformed. Her armor was restored, sleek and unbroken, and her eyes burned brighter than ever. She approached Caleb, her movements more confident, more regal. She spoke again, her voice carrying a new authority. Though he couldn't understand her words, he felt the weight of their meaning. She was more than just a stranded traveler. She was a warrior, perhaps even a leader, on a mission far beyond anything he could comprehend. Before he could respond, the ground shook. The creatures from before had returned, their guttural howls echoing through the cavern. Caleb raised his rifle, but Ky'rea placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. She stepped forward, her posture commanding. The markings on the walls flared to life, and a series of crystalline structures emerged from the floor, forming a barrier between them and the advancing creatures. Ky'rea turned to Caleb, her expression resolute. She gestured for him to leave, pointing toward the cavern's entrance. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving you." She cupped his face with one hand, her touch gentle. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, the fierce warrior was gone, replaced by the vulnerable woman who had sought refuge in his igloo. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his, a gesture that felt intimate and final. Before Caleb could protest further, the crystalline barrier solidified, cutting him off from her. He pounded on the barrier, shouting her name, but she didn't look back. The last thing he saw was her silhouette, glowing with an otherworldly light, as she faced the advancing horde. Caleb waited outside the cavern for days, hoping against hope that Ky'rea would return. But the cavern remained silent, its glow dimmed. When he finally left, it was with a heavy heart and a newfound sense of purpose. He didn't know if he would ever see Ky'rea again, but he carried her memory with him, a reminder that even in the harshest wilderness, there was beauty, connection, and the spark of something greater than himself. As he made his way back to his igloo, the stars above seemed brighter, their cold light a promise that her story, and his, was far from over. The trek back to the igloo was marked by an emptiness Caleb hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the same kind of loneliness that had driven him to the Arctic wilderness in the first place. That had been a dull ache, a wound he'd learned to live with. This was sharper, more immediate, a fresh void left by Ky'rea's absence. Each step he took across the tundra felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the universe was pressing down on him. He replayed the final moments in the cavern over and over in his mind, her radiant form, the crystalline barrier, the quiet but firm farewell. He had wanted to fight beside her, to share in her struggle, but she had made her choice. And now, he was left to carry the fragments of their bond in a world that felt colder and more indifferent than ever. When Caleb finally reached the igloo, it felt smaller and less like home. The firelight, once a comforting beacon, now cast shadows that seemed to mock him. He went through the motions of survival, mending his gear, hunting, and tending to his fire, but his mind was elsewhere. He found himself staring at the horizon for hours, scanning for any sign of her, any flicker of movement that might mean she had returned. But the tundra remained silent. One night, as he sat by the fire, a faint glow appeared on the edge of his vision. It wasn't the northern lights, which danced frequently across the Arctic sky, nor was it the eerie phosphorescence of the ice. It was something else, something purposeful. Caleb rose, his heart pounding. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, his breath steaming in the frigid air. The glow grew brighter, resolving into a series of orbs hovering above the snow. They moved in unison, weaving a path toward him. Caleb tightened his grip on the rifle, but didn't raise it. Somehow, he knew this wasn't a threat. The orb stopped a few feet away, pulsating gently. Then, as if responding to an unseen command, they arranged themselves in a pattern he recognized, the same markings that had adorned the walls of the cavern. The glow intensified, and a soft, melodic hum filled the air. Caleb's pulse quickened. He recognized the sound. It was Ky'rea's language. Before he could speak, the orbs shifted again, forming an image. It was Ky'rea, or rather a projection of her. She looked just as she had the last time he saw her, her form radiant and regal. Her expression was calm, but resolute. "Caleb," she said, her voice carrying a faint, metallic quality. Hearing her speak his name in a language he understood sent a jolt through him. "Ky'rea," he breathed, stepping closer. "Are you alive? Where are you?" The projection flickered, her image wavering like a reflection on water. She gestured toward the markings formed by the orbs, and though her words were garbled at times, Caleb understood enough. She had succeeded in her mission, whatever it had been, but at great cost. She was far away now, beyond the reach of Earth's tundra, but she had sent this message to him, a parting gift to ensure he understood her gratitude. Her voice softened, and she spoke of their bond, how it had given her the strength to complete her task. She described him as a kindred spirit, someone who had reminded her of what it meant to fight not just for survival, but for connection. Caleb's throat tightened, and he struggled to hold back tears. He had never thought of himself as a source of strength for anyone, let alone a being as extraordinary as Ky'rea. "Will I ever see you again?" he asked, his voice breaking. Her projection hesitated, as if considering her answer. Then she nodded, a faint but deliberate gesture. The orbs pulsed brighter, their hum rising in pitch. Caleb felt a warmth wash over him, a sensation that banished the cold of the Arctic night. He didn't fully understand what it meant, whether it was a promise, a farewell, or something in between, but it filled him with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. The orbs began to drift away, their light dimming as they rose into the sky. Ky'rea's image faded, her final smile etched into Caleb's memory. He watched until the glow disappeared completely, leaving him alone under the starlit expanse. In the days that followed, Caleb found a new purpose in his routines. The Arctic was no less harsh, but it no longer felt as empty. He began carving patterns into the walls of his igloo, replicas of the markings he had seen in the cavern and the orbs. They were a reminder, not just of Ky'rea, but of the connection they had shared and the possibility that their paths might cross again. He took more risks in his explorations, venturing farther than he ever had before. Each new horizon felt like a step closer to understanding the vastness of the universe and his place within it. And though he never saw Ky'rea again, he carried her presence with him, a quiet strength that guided him through the cold and the dark. On nights when the northern lights danced across the sky, Caleb would sit outside his igloo, gazing up at the swirling colors. He liked to imagine that one of those lights was Ky'rea, watching over him from wherever she was. And in his heart, he knew that their story wasn't over. Not yet. Somewhere, out there in the infinite expanse, their paths would converge again. Until then, Caleb would keep the fire burning, a beacon in the wilderness, waiting for the day when the alien Huntress might once again crawl into his world, seeking warmth. The years rolled on, each one carving its mark into Caleb's rugged face and weathered hands. Life in the Arctic had a rhythm, and he had long since learned to live by its tune. Yet even as he hunted, built shelters, and charted the changing landscape of the tundra, the memory of Ky'rea never faded. She was a constant presence in his mind, a flicker of light in the cold expanse of his solitude. The igloo where they had first met became a shrine of sorts, though Caleb would never have admitted it aloud. The carvings on its walls grew more intricate over time. He didn't know if anyone else would ever see them, but that didn't matter. They were for her. For him. For the connection that had transformed his life. One winter evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, a familiar hum drifted through the air. Caleb froze, the sound striking a chord deep within him. He turned toward the source, his breath catching as he saw a faint glow on the horizon. It wasn't the northern lights. This light was steady, deliberate, and moving closer. Heart pounding, Caleb grabbed his rifle, not as a weapon, but as a tool of survival, and headed toward the glow. The tundra was treacherous at night, with snow concealing cracks in the ice and predators lurking in the shadows. But Caleb moved with a confidence born of years in the wilderness, his boots crunching against the snow as he followed the light. As he crested a ridge, the source of the glow came into view. A small, sleek vessel, unlike anything Caleb had ever seen. It was angular yet organic, its surface pulsing faintly with an iridescent sheen. The hum grew louder as he approached, and the air seemed to vibrate with energy. The vessel's surface shimmered, and a hatch opened. Caleb stopped in his tracks, his breath clouding the air. From the shadows within, a figure emerged. It was her. Ky'rea stepped out of the vessel, her movements as graceful and deliberate as he remembered. Her armor was different now, sleeker, more intricate, and glowing with a faint blue light. Her luminous eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then she smiled. "Caleb," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that melted the ice in his chest. She had learned his language, or at least enough of it to speak his name with a familiarity that made his heart ache. "Ky'rea," he whispered, taking a cautious step forward. "You came back." She nodded, her expression soft but tinged with something else. Urgency, perhaps. She gestured toward the vessel and then to the sky, speaking rapidly in her melodic, clicking language. Caleb understood only fragments, but the message was clear. She needed his help. Inside the vessel, Caleb was struck by its alien beauty. The walls were smooth and iridescent, pulsating with light that seemed to respond to Ky'rea's movements. She guided him to a central chamber, where a series of holographic projections flickered into existence. The images were chaotic, a planet engulfed in flames, creatures like the ones they had fought in the cavern, and others even more grotesque. Among the chaos, Caleb saw Ky'rea's kind, tall, luminous beings like her, fighting desperately against the tide. Ky'rea pointed to the images, her expression grim. She spoke slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. "War," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "My people need you." Caleb blinked, stunned. "Me? I'm just a man. What can I do?" Ky'rea stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. Her touch was cool, but it sent a warmth through him. "You heart. Strong." She gestured to the carvings on her vessel's walls, symbols he recognized from the cavern and his igloo. "You fight. Together." Her words stirred something deep within him. He had spent years surviving in isolation, but Ky'rea had shown him that he was capable of more. She had seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself, a strength, a resilience, and, perhaps, a spark of hope. He looked into her luminous eyes and nodded. Together, the vessel rose into the sky, carrying Caleb and Ky'rea away from the frozen expanse he had called home for so long. As the Arctic fell away beneath them, Caleb felt a pang of sadness, but also a growing sense of purpose. The stars stretched out before them, a vast and infinite expanse. For the first time, he didn't feel small beneath their gaze. He felt ready. Ky'rea sat beside him in the cockpit, her posture poised, but her expression soft. She reached out, her hand brushing against his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. The journey ahead would be dangerous. Caleb knew that. He didn't know what role he would play in the conflict that awaited them or how a lone human could make a difference in a war among the stars. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. And as the vessel disappeared into the cosmos, Caleb allowed himself to hope, not just for Ky'rea's people, but for himself. For the chance to build something greater than survival. For the chance to fight for a future worth living for. The journey through the stars was nothing short of miraculous. Caleb marveled at the vastness of space, the swirling nebulae, and the shimmering constellations that stretched farther than his mind could fathom. Ky'rea sat beside him, her gaze focused on the controls of the vessel. Yet, she often glanced his way, her expression softening whenever their eyes met. As they approached her homeworld, Caleb was struck by its beauty. It hung in the void like a luminous jewel, its surface a patchwork of glittering oceans, verdant forests, and crystalline cities that shimmered like stars on the planet itself. It was unlike anything he had imagined, and for a moment, he forgot about the war, the danger, and the unknown future that lay ahead. The reception on Ky'rea's world was tense but hopeful. Her people, tall and elegant like her, regarded Caleb with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. They spoke in their melodic, clicking language, their tones rising and falling in a harmony that Caleb could only begin to interpret. Ky'rea stood beside him, her hand lightly touching his arm, a silent reassurance. She explained his role to her people, weaving a story of resilience, courage, and the strength of the human spirit. Caleb didn't understand every word, but he could feel the emotion in her voice. She spoke of the Arctic, the battles they had fought together, and the bond they had forged. Slowly, the skepticism in the room gave way to nods of understanding and even faint smiles. One elder, her skin glowing faintly blue, stepped forward and placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. She spoke a single word he understood: welcome. The war against the monstrous invaders was fierce, but Caleb found his place among Ky'rea's people. They valued his resourcefulness, his ability to adapt, and his unwavering determination. He learned to fight alongside them, wielding alien technology and strategies that at first felt foreign but soon became second nature. Ky'rea and Caleb often fought side by side, their movements synchronized in a way that felt almost instinctual. They shared victories and defeats, their bond growing stronger with each battle. Though the odds often seemed insurmountable, Caleb discovered a strength within himself he hadn't known existed. Months turned into years, and slowly, the tide began to turn. Ky'rea's people, bolstered by Caleb's unorthodox tactics and their own unyielding resolve, began to reclaim their world. The invaders were driven back, their forces shattered, until at last, the war was won. On the day of the final victory, the skies above Ky'rea's homeworld were filled with light. Great arcs of energy danced across the heavens, a celebration that spanned the entire planet. Caleb stood on a crystalline balcony overlooking a vast city, the cheers of Ky'rea's people echoing in the air. Ky'rea approached him, her armor gleaming in the light of the twin suns. She smiled, and for the first time in years, Caleb allowed himself to truly feel at peace. "It's over," he said, his voice filled with wonder. She nodded, stepping closer. "Because of you?" He shook his head. "Because of us." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had endured settling into a quiet understanding. Then, without hesitation, Ky'rea reached for his hand. Her touch was cool but familiar, and as their fingers intertwined, Caleb felt a warmth that banished the last of his doubts. "You stay?" she asked, her voice tentative. Caleb smiled. "If you'll have me." Her answering smile was radiant, her luminous eyes soft with emotion. "Always." In the years that followed, Caleb became an integral part of Ky'rea's world. Though he was human, he was embraced as one of their own, a symbol of unity and the strength that could be found in even the most unexpected alliances. He and Ky'rea built a life together, one that blended the traditions of her people with the resilience of his own. They often visited the Arctic in her vessel, a place that remained sacred to both of them. It was there, beneath the northern lights, that they celebrated their union, surrounded by the beauty of the wilderness that had brought them together. And as the years turned to decades, their story became legend. A tale of an alien huntress and a human survivor who defied the odds, united by courage, love, and the belief that even in the coldest reaches of the universe, warmth could be found. Together, they proved that no matter how vast the stars or how distant the worlds, connections could bridge any divide. And in that bond, they found not just survival but a life worth living.